January 17th, 1940. A winter dusk settles over Berlin early, the kind that turns the Spree into a strip of black glass and makes every street lamp look like it is burning under frost. In the courtyards behind the blocks, coal smoke hangs low and sweet bitter in the throat. The air carries the scrape of boots on ice and the faint, metallic clatter of tram lines cooling in the dark. A radio in a warm room speaks in confident cadences of distance and destiny, of oceans, of frontiers, of a Reich protected by geography as much as by steel. In those first months of war, many Germans believed the map itself was a weapon. The English Channel had been a moat in 1914. The Atlantic, 200 miles of heaving water from the nearest Allied airfields to the German coastline and far more to Berlin, seemed an unbridgeable shield. Even as the Luftwaffe expanded and the flak towers rose, there was a deeper assumption that modern war might hammer borders, but it still respected the old tyranny of range. The capital could be threatened, yes, by sabotage, by rumors, by some distant naval blockade, but not by an armada of American heavy bombers appearing in the white noon sky like a new kind of weather. That belief mattered because it was not just strategic. It was ideological. Distance was proof, to the men who marched and the men who listened, that history favored the strong. A continent organized under German power could become self-sufficient. Enemies could be starved and contained. Democracies across oceans could protest, send speeches, send money, but could not send 1,000 engines over Berlin in daylight. In that lull, geography became comfort, and comfort became policy. Yet war has a way of turning comforts into traps. By 1943, Berlin was no stranger to air raid sirens. The Royal Air Force had carried the night war deep into Germany, and Berlin endured repeated attacks as the RAF pursued its Battle of Berlin. The sky had already become contested space, and the population had learned the routine, the siren's rising wail, the hurried descent into cellars, the stale breath of shelters, the long night of thuds and distant fires. But night bombing, for all its terror, still allowed one psychological refuge: darkness. Darkness suggested uncertainty, limitation, the idea that even a powerful enemy had to hide to strike. The Americans insisted on something else. Daylight, the theory behind the U.S. Army Air Force's daylight bombing campaign was brutal in its clarity, precision by sight, industrial paralysis, and the forcing of the Luftwaffe into battle where it could be destroyed. But theory bled in the skies of 1943. Deep penetrations without adequate escort produced catastrophic losses, and formations of B-17 flying fortresses, built to absorb punishment, proved that even a fortress can be opened if attacked long enough. The air war reached a crisis point, and out of that crisis came an answer that looked to German eyes like a technical detail, but would become a strategic earthquake: long-range fighter escort. By early 1944, the P-51 Mustang and longer-legged P-47s, carrying drop tanks, could accompany heavy bombers far beyond the old limits. Operation Argument, Big Week, 20 to 25. February 1944 was designed not only to smash aircraft factories and ball-bearing production, but to lure German fighters into the air and kill them in quantity. In that single week, the USAAF flew nearly 4,000 heavy bomber sorties and dropped more than 20 million pounds of bombs. It lost more than 200 heavy bombers and suffered about 2,600 casualties. Losses that would have been crippling for most nations, but were absorbed and replaced by American production and training systems that seemed inexhaustible. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, lost 1/3 of its available fighter aircraft and, more critically, could not replace 1/5 of its veteran fighter pilots. This was the hidden hinge in the story. The Germans expected war to be decided by mastery of Europe, by oil, by steel, by discipline, by the ability to mobilize a people under command. What they experienced instead was an enemy system that could lose hundreds of aircraft in a week and return again, not diminished, but sharpened. An industrial democracy that converted freedom into output, argument into logistics, elections into engines. And so Berlin, once protected by distance, then haunted by night, was marked for something more. A demonstration in daylight that no ocean, no winter, and no ideology could keep the American air arm at bay. On March 6, 1944, across East Anglia, runways glisten under pale morning. Ground crews move like shadows under wings, checking fuel lines and bomb shackles, wiping frost from canopies. Briefing rooms smell of wet wool and cigarette smoke. On maps, the route arrows point across the North Sea, over the Reich, and into the heart of it, Berlin. The U.S. Army Air Forces conducted its first major raid against Berlin that day. 672 heavy bombers struck the city, and 69 were shot down. For German defenders, this was not merely another raid. It was a statement that the old geometry of safety was collapsing. American heavy bombers, machines of aluminum and rivets, each one a flying community of men, had crossed the water and returned with the sun still on their wings. The Luftwaffe fought, and flak tore holes in the sky, and dozens of bombers did not come back. But the raid happened. The Reich's capital could be struck by day. 2 days later, the Americans returned with 462 bombers escorted by 174 P-51s. This is where expectation and experience begin to diverge with a cruel precision, and German soldiers, and many German civilians, had been raised on the promise that willpower could bend the modern world, that a disciplined nation could outmatch messy democracies. They expected enemies to tire, to bargain, to fracture along political lines. They expected the Atlantic to be an argument they would never have to answer. But what they experienced was repetition on an industrial scale. They heard the approach of massed engines like a storm that did not respect borders. They saw contrails stitching the sky into grids. They watched in bright noon the slow choreography of combat boxes, formation flying as a kind of mechanical faith, turning toward the city with the steadiness of a factory conveyor belt. And here, a single symbolic object begins to matter. Small, ordinary, recurring. The American ration bar, and the chocolate that rode in pockets and flight suits, intended as emergency food and as morale, a compact sweetness carried across oceans. It was not a weapon. It did not explode. But it represented something Germany struggled to understand. Abundance made portable, calories made systematic, a democracy's industry condensed into a rectangle of nourishment. Where German civilians counted grams and scraped ration cards, American airmen carried chocolate into the upper air as casually as they carried maps. On the German side, the war economy grew tighter, more desperate. On the American side, even in hardship, there were ration bars, canned goods, cigarettes, coffee, small tokens of a vast supply chain. In the air war, these details mattered because they were the hidden foundation under the visible armadas. The armadas were not miracles, so as they were logistics. By 1945, the scale became almost surreal. On March 18, 1945, the largest wartime raid on Berlin was launched. 1,329 bombers and 733 fighters of the U.S. 8th Air Force formed over England. 1,221 of the bombers were headed for Berlin. This is the moment your title reaches for, though the phrase 1,200 B-17s compresses a more complex reality. The force bound for Berlin on that day included heavy bombers in massive numbers. The documented figure for bombers headed to Berlin was 1,221, within a total of 1,329 bombers on the mission. In German imagination, the Atlantic had once been a wall. Now it was merely the first stretch of a supply line. That March morning, the sky over England filled with aircraft until it no longer looked like a sky. It looked like a moving ceiling, metallic, droning, layered. And when the sound, this is what survivors often remembered, was not the sharp crack of a single plane, but the continuous thunder of many. A democracy's voice translated into engines. American intelligence officers warned crews to watch for a new terror, the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, capable of speeds far beyond piston aircraft. Germany still had brilliance, still had innovation, still had moments of lethal surprise. In the battle that followed, jets from Jagdgeschwader 7 cut through bomber formations with frightening speed. In just 8 minutes, 30 jets shot down 7 B-17s. And yet the brilliance arrived late, like a door bolted after the flood has already entered the room. Flak over Berlin and along the approach routes inflicted widespread damage. But more than half of the bombers, 714 planes, sustained damage from anti-aircraft fire, and 16 were hit so severely they crash-landed behind Soviet lines. In total, 24 bombers and 6 fighters were lost on the mission. 178 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. The German Luftwaffe, despite these successes, could not stop the bombs from falling. The mission aimed at rail stations and tank factories to support the Russian advance, but cloud and inaccuracy scattered impacts. More than 3,000 tons of bombs fell across the city. Conservative estimates put German civilian losses around 3,000. This is the emotional contrast, sharpened into an image. German defenders expecting that courage and technology might still keep the capital sacred, and experiencing instead that sacredness is irrelevant when the enemy can send more aircraft than you can meaningfully count. It is also where transformation takes root. For years, Nazi propaganda had promised control over labor, over borders, over information, over the very idea of fear. But fear cannot be legislated out of the air. When daylight raids multiplied, the psychological contract between regime and population eroded. The state could still demand obedience, still punish dissent, still draft boys and old men into the Volkssturm. But it could not promise safety. And for German soldiers, whether on leave in Berlin or hearing reports from home, the raids became proof that the war was not a distant campaign of maneuver. It was a grinding siege of the entire society. The expected war of swift victories and continental dominance became, in experience, a war of attrition against an opponent whose factories were beyond reach and whose distance was no longer distance at all. Meanwhile, for American airmen, the experience was a different kind of transformation. Many had arrived in England with a vision of clean, rational war. Hit a factory, cripple production, shorten suffering. The reality was flak bursts like black flowers at altitude, aircraft shuddering as if struck by invisible hammers, friends disappearing into cloud with engines aflame. They carried in their pockets that small ration bar, chocolate, dense and reassuring, sometimes uneaten for hours because oxygen masks and cold made swallowing difficult. In the midst of violence, sweetness became a reminder of home and of purpose, to a sensory proof that they came from a society that could afford to feed men well even while sending them into harm. That is the symbolism that can recur without melodrama. Chocolate at 25,000 feet. Democracy's abundance condensed into an emergency ration, and below, a city where rationing and ruin turned food into arithmetic. Historical evidence does not always arrive as grand quotes carved into stone. Sometimes it arrives as official numbers that feel like weather reports. 672 heavy bombers, 69 shot down, 1,329 bombers, 733 fighters, 1,221 bound for Berlin. 714 damaged by flak. These figures are the fingerprints of industrial war. They tell you not only what happened, but what kind of world produced it. And the world that produced it was not the world Germany had expected to fight. In 1940, as German planners could plausibly imagine Britain isolated, the Soviet Union defeated, and American democracy too divided or too distant to matter decisively. But the United States turned distance into a production problem and then solved it. It trained air crews by the tens of thousands, built aircraft by the tens of thousands, and shipped them to an island airfield network from which Berlin could be reached again and again. The ocean became not a moat, but a highway. Dangerous, certainly, but navigable by convoy, by liberty ship, by a relentless schedule. The Me 262 symbolized a different German hope, that superior technology could restore control. And it did briefly, in the tactical sense. The jet could slash through formations, fire rockets, disappear into cloud. German jets shot down 63 bombers in the final months of the war. But technology without time, without fuel, without trained pilots, without an intact infrastructure, becomes a beautiful weapon wielded by exhausted hands. The jets arrived in a sky already owned by Allied numbers and Allied escort doctrine. So what changed in the German mind when daylight armadas began to appear? For some, it hardened fatalism into obedience. Fight on because there is nothing else. For others, it began to crack belief. Not necessarily into rebellion. The regime's terror was too thorough for that. But belief can die quietly. It can be replaced by a private arithmetic. How many raids? How many fires? How many funerals? How many ration cards? How many nights without sleep? It can be replaced by the realization that propaganda cannot shoot down bombers. For the Allies, and Berlin became a symbol, too, of the enemy's political heart and of the promise that the war could be ended by crushing the system that sustained it. But the war did not end with a single raid or even 100. It ended with armies meeting on rivers, with cities encircled, with the ideology itself collapsing under the weight of its own violence. In the end, March 18, 1945, rated only a single paragraph in the official U.S. Army Air Force's history, despite being the largest Allied raid on Berlin. That, too, is revealing. What felt apocalyptic to those below and those in the air could become, in official memory, one mission among many, because the real story was not a single day's drama, but the cumulative logic of capacity. And capacity was where democracy proved its most devastating argument. The recurring object, the ration bar, with the small chocolate carried into the cold, returns here not as sentiment, but as symbol. In the great machinery of total war, it is easy to focus on tonnage and formations and losses. Yet wars are also decided by the mundane, the ability to feed crews, to replace engines, to ship oxygen bottles, to print maps, to train navigators, to maintain radio discipline, to issue emergency rations that might mean the difference between a man walking out of a crash site alive or dying in the snow. Chocolate, carried over Berlin, becomes a quiet emblem of a system that can be generous even while it is violent, abundant even while it is strained, capable of replacing loss without collapsing into hunger. For Germans under bombardment, the symbol is inverted. The shelter, the ration card, the emptied shop shelves, the thin soup. Two systems in collision, and then the collision is audible in the engines overhead. By the time Berlin finally fell, the question of protection had been answered in full. 200 miles of ocean did not protect Germany from America, because America had learned to treat distance as a solvable equation. An equation of shipyards and airfields, of escort fighters and production lines, of sorties and supply. The German soldier who once believed that maps were shields had to face a stranger truth, that in the modern age, geography is only as strong as the system behind it. An ocean is not a wall against a nation that can build bridges of aluminum, one bomber after another, until the sky itself becomes a corridor. And somewhere in the wreckage of that realization is a larger reflection, one that outlives the ruins. Freedom is not merely an idea spoken in the parliaments. It is also a kind of capacity, messy, argumentative, inefficient in appearance, yet able to mobilize minds and materials on a scale that tyrannies often cannot sustain. Abundance is not merely comfort, it is endurance. And ideology, when it promises invulnerability, is always vulnerable to the simplest fact, that reality does not negotiate. In a war where cities burned and men fell from the stratosphere, a small ration bar, chocolate in a frozen pocket, could be carried across an ocean and over a capital that once thought itself unreachable. It was a minor object, almost ridiculous beside bombs and jets. Yet it was also a reminder that the world Germany tried to dominate was larger than its borders, and that the democracies it dismissed could turn their ordinary abundance into extraordinary reach. The engines faded, and the contrails dispersed. The sirens stopped. But the lesson remained, written not only in the broken stones of Berlin, but in the new shape of the world that followed, that no distance is permanent, no shield is absolute, and no ideology, however confident, can outlast the combined force of human will and human capacity when that capacity is organized, replenished, and sustained.